Good morning. This is session 4 of the FRC Food Recovery Council, bringing you the Maine Master Community Composter course, originally recorded live from the Samoset in Rockport and later remastered, presented by Mark King, Organics Management Specialist, Division of Materials Management, Maine DEP. And who we are, the FRC is a group of like-minded individuals with a goal in mind, minimizing food waste. We hope this class helps with that. How do you get involved? You can reach out to us, send an email, call the office. We are working on a survey, hoping to get a lot of participation and find out what you folks need and want. Just a little bit about the 2026 Solid Waste Diversion Grant Program. The deadline was Monday. There's funding available to do different projects in your communities related to organic waste, source reduction strategies, upcycling to reuse, composting, and digestive activities. The certification for taking this course will serve as a demonstration of technical ability, which is required when you apply for a permit by rule from the Maine DEP for a compost area. Individuals completing all 5 webinars or videos will be eligible to take a 50-question certification exam, and upon receiving a passing score of 70%, individuals may apply for the certification. Now remember, to take the test is free. To watch all these videos are free. If you want to get certified, there's a small charge because we are going to bring you some good stuff. We have a compost thermometer, educational toolkit to start your own program, and a couple stickers, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So just to recap real quick, we did the biology of compost first, then compost feedstocks and recipe, and then compost methods and systems. And if you missed any of those, you're going to go to mra.net to download them after the air date. The 4th series, building and managing your compost pile. And we did broadcast that live, and today we're doing it again so we get more of the correct slides and that. So the 5th and final video will be aired, whatever you want to call it, in May. We're going to have Mark, Ash, and Victor to demonstrate feedstock assessment, recipe development, pile building, process management, and troubleshooting. And just remember, these are free, and you can find them at mra.net under the FRC logo. Watch them as many times as you like to be prepared for your certification test. So this sticker, not actual size, this will go on our lending carts. We're going to be working on a little program for the folks that get certified if they want to do a pilot project in their town. But each person that gets certified, they're going to get 2 of these stickers. If they have their own carts, then they can put them on their carts and they don't have to do the lending. Here's Mark King's contact info. I think he'll show that again later one more time. And all food's too good to waste. We're now going to listen to Mark and learn all about composting.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Vic. And let's see here. I'll do this one right here. Share. All right. So let me make sure we're working here.
Excellent. I can see it.
Okay. And let me, okay. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 4th webinar in the series. We're going to talk a little bit to start with about what we learned from the last talk, the systems talk. We did discuss there are 6 main systems that are out there, starting with the simplest, the backyard. They're very inexpensive. I'll show you some pictures of these in a minute. They're limited to 1 to 5 cubic yards in size. If you get any bigger, they're really hard to manage, and any smaller, and they don't have enough mass in order to keep heat during the winter. We talked a little bit about the Maryland bin system, which was basically a step up from the backyard system. I'll show you some pictures of those as well. They were designed originally for poultry mortalities, but they work well for pretty much everything. Then we have the standbys of the static pile, the aerated static pile, and the turned windrow, all of which are used on most farms and other facilities in the state of Maine and across the country because they're fairly simple to build and design yourself. If you wish to have something more fail-proof and have the money for it, then an in-vessel system might be what you're looking for. They tend to be very expensive. All processes are pretty much enclosed and evacuated into some sort of biofilter or unit for odor control. And they can be very good if you have close neighbors and you want a system that's not going to have any potential odors. So very, very good stuff. The one thing that we learned is that each system has a benefit to you and it also has a limitation. And those limitations are often what drive us to a bigger or better system after we start playing with the first one. But the most important thing is do your research, find out what other people are saying, find out the costs, and match it to your budget. Okay. So this is just an example of some common backyard systems that people use. The one we advocate strongly here in Maine is the one on the upper left. It's called the lobster trap bin. It's a 12-foot section of lobster trap wire that's 4 feet wide. This is a material they use to build lobster traps with. When turned into a cylinder, it'll actually hold a cubic yard of material, which over the years I've done several research projects and have found that if you have a minimum of 1 cubic yard, you can keep heat through the winter. The Earth machine, which is one that's been popular over the years, only holds 0.4 cubic yards, so it's prone to freezing in the winter. The one on the bottom is a 3 bin system. Each one holds a cubic yard, and it is the system that the Maryland bin is designed upon. It's just a little bit bigger. The way this works is you fill the first one on the left till it's full, and then you flip it into the middle bin, and then you start to fill the one on the left again. When that one's full, you flip the middle to the last and the first to the middle. The idea is at the end, you get 3 positive turns and pretty well mixed compost. This is the Maryland bin system. These bins are roughly 10 by 10 by 10, and it's the same idea as the previous smaller 3 cubic yard system. You basically fill one bay. This time you wait about 2 weeks, then you turn it to the middle bay, wait another 2 weeks, turn it to the third bay for 2 more weeks, and then you flip it out for final curing. The way these systems work best is you start out with a base of 18 inches of active compost media, would be things like horse manure compost, any type of carbon source that has some active material in it. And then you place whatever you're going to compost on top of that bed and then cover with an additional 36 inches of active material. The idea for the 2 weeks is to allow it to precondition and to let the microbial activity build. And then each time you turn it, it gives the microbes a chance to consume more food as they're mixed around. They have more food that becomes available to them. So very, very good system. It's used a lot for mortality management and also for leaves and yard trimmings and grass clippings. Then one of the most common systems out there, we see this in 85 to 90% of the transfer stations across the state and across the country. This is where you use a front end loader and you build a pile. And most piles, we want to keep them under 8 feet tall as the weight of the material above can compress the core, which we want to keep active and aerobic. But in the case of leaves, the pile can be 15, 20 feet tall because they're light and fluffy and there's no danger of them collapsing that inner core until they're well into finished compost mode. This one is a really unique one. People tend to love this because if you have a very small space, you can put your piles right next to each other and you don't have to worry about turning them because the initial mixture is critical. So as long as you have a good mixture to start with, when you build these piles, you don't have to turn them again, at least for 2 to 3 weeks. The thing I like about these systems is that once you get that good homogeneous blend, you basically place it over this air device. And as you can see, this little blower on the left is the same one that goes to a bouncy house that would inflate a small castle for a kid's birthday party. But you put it on for 5 to 10 minutes every hour or every couple hours, and that gives enough supplemental airflow to allow the pile to go and compost aerobically. The one on the right is a new design that I've been working with, and it's using a roll-off container with an open front end. And the idea is you put 18 inches of wood chips in the base, And then you build your compost pile on top of that. You open the door and point it into the prevailing wind. And the advantage of that is that as the wind blows, it forces air under the pile and forces it up through the pile, keeping the process very aerobic. And I've used this successfully for mortality management because the other benefit is that if you manage the mortalities and you don't want to have any potential, let's say they have like chronic wasting disease or some other disease, and you're worried about it getting out, once you're done composting, you shut the door, attach it with a roll-off truck, and then you can take it wherever you want to dispose of it. So it's a very self-contained, neat system that is very helpful. Then we have turned windrow. Most of them are either done in Maine and other states by a front end loader, as all facilities have one, or you can have a tractor with a tow behind turner, or if you have the money, you can get one that will straddle the piles. The problem with all these systems are that you can't put the piles right on top of each other because you need room for the machine to travel through. So you need to have an alleyway for the tractor. So between the piles, and you also need to have space for the front end loader to maneuver all around in order to get things happening. So definitely these systems are very popular, but they do have challenges in how much you can fit on the site at one time. Then you get to the more complicated systems. These are the in-vessel systems. And this is an example of the one at the University of Maine, the Maine Center up in Orono. And that is that this machine has agitation and aeration. And the idea is that as it moves forward, it mixes the material and puts it back a little bit. So at the end of 21 days, it's gone through about 42 to 47 feet of composting. And the whole time, all the off gases that come out of the compost process are vacuumed into a biofilter where they're treated so there's no odors released. So this is another really nice system. Very expensive. This was around 125,000 just for the unit. So now that we've done that, we're going to dip a bit into biology and once again focus on the four major criteria that every compost pile needs. They need carbon. Carbon is the material that we call browns. It's the material that is great for absorbing liquid. And as we mentioned in the biology class, when you absorb liquid, you take away the potential for odor. But it's also the food source for the microbes. As they feed, it gives them energy and it helps them thrive. Nitrogen is often the stuff that we're trying to compost. It's the food scraps, it's the fish gurry, it's all the things that tend to be very putrescible, tend to be very stinky. Their C-to-N ratio is really low, so that means they have a high propensity to produce odors. But this is the material that the microbes use to make more microbes and to replicate themselves. So that's very, very important. Then we learned in biology that if you have oxygen in your pile will run perfectly and there won't be any odors. The only things that should come out of the pile are carbon dioxide as it respires and also water vapor. Both of those things are what help result in the pile reduction. We know that at the end of the compost process, roughly 40% of the original volume has been lost to volatilization. So that's something that we keep in mind. And we need about 5% in the pile, which is really important. We take in 21% and the pile gives off 16% and 5 stays there. That's very similar to us. We need 5% in our bodies. And when you go to give somebody mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, you're able to still give them oxygen because 16% comes out when you exhale as well. So, which is a good thing. Finally, moisture. We want around 55% moisture. That's where the microbes live. We talked about the fact that the way you determine it is not with a moisture meter. You grab a handful and give it a good hard squeeze. If water shoots out your knuckles, it's too wet. If you open your hand and it crumbles away, it's too dry. And if you open your hand and it's a nice ball that's moist on the outside, that's just right. So as far as getting started, we get our feedstocks to the site. What do we do next? Well, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that they are similar in texture, similar in particle size. The more different they are, the harder it is to get a good even mix. So one thing that we can do is grind them. That makes them smaller. Now, the smaller you make a particle, the better it is for composting as well because it increases the surface area for the microbial activity. So we always want to do that. But if you grind it too small, then when the particles come together, they can actually collapse airspace and make it so that the pile can't breathe. So I like to see between a half inch and an inch in particle size for a lot of my compost items. And then we look at mixing options. You can use various pieces of equipment to mix. We're going to discuss a bunch of those in a second. And then we're going to talk about how to actually build the piles themselves. So this is the next series. So grinding, it does increase the surface area of the particles, so that's good for microbial activity. It allows better mixing. If the particles are very similar in size, they mix together better. It helps to speed up degradation through physical breakdown of the particles. And you definitely want to have a good balance of fine and coarse. Fine is what absorbs the liquids, and coarse is what keeps the pile structure so that air can flow through evenly in the pile. Some of the methods that you can grind with, and I'm going to show you pictures of each of these, are tub grinders. A lot of facilities that do large amounts of leaf and yard material will have a tub grinder. Some facilities will have a hammer mill or a shredder. They prefer to have a more aggressive activity to help do their mixing and grinding. And then you have farms that have rototillers and other types of equipment that can be modified to do mixing as well. So let's take a look here. Tub grinder, really simple. That bowl that looks like a little parquet bowl on top, that spins around rapidly, and that's what causes the material to be drawn towards a cutting, grinding area. And they do a decent job. The old ones were built rather differently, and what would usually happen is that when stuff was dropped in, if it didn't get into the center, it would be flung out. So you had to be very careful to wear a hard hat around these devices because they were known as salad shooters and could cause potential bodily harm if a chunk of wood came out and got you. The case of a hammer mill or a shredder, the idea is you have these hammers that move past each other and they pulverize everything in their way. I'm sure you've seen on Facebook and some of these social media sites where they'll take one of these shredders and they'll put different tanks and bicycles and things in it just to watch them get crushed. And people tend to spend a lot of time watching those things happen. But the idea is that the material is forced against each other and sheared. So it's a great way to reduce particle size. But if you have something that's really moist, it can also cause a lot of gumming of these. So whenever we use a device like this and we're composting carcasses, for example, I will add carbon, carcass, carbon so that there's less apt for that goo to build up and cause it to get gummed up. This is a typical rototiller that's used in gardens, and some folks will actually lay out their compost material and use the rototiller to mix it, and then use the bucket of the tractor to raise the pile back up again. And that can work very well if you have limitations in what you can afford. This is a flail mower, very similar to the rototiller idea. You can raise it or lower it a little more so you can get a mix that doesn't necessarily turn dirt into it. You want to be really careful when you're mixing your compost. If you put dirt in, it doesn't have a lot of energy, a lot of those volatile solids we talked about because it's pretty played out. So if you mix it in, it can actually stall or often kill the compost process. So with a flail mower, you want to lift it up a little bit so you're not getting dirt in your compost. And then this is a forward chopper. Once again, it creates a great grind. And the idea is that that material then can make a really nice compost. So mixing, the most important part of mixing, I told you at the very beginning in the biology class that the first chance to control odors is receiving your wet material into a pile of dry carbon and then covering it. Because as that liquid is absorbed, it takes away its odor potential. Your second chance to control odors in your compost process is doing a thorough mixing and blending. Because now you're distributing that moisture and you're creating the blueprint for microbes to start colonizing and making that pile more lively. So it's a really good thing. And we always want to have that equal balance because it allows the airflow through and it prevents the anaerobic activity within the pile. But no matter what you do, if you start out with a wet pile, you're going to have an anaerobic nature and you'll just need to turn it more often until you get it to where it's aerobic. So don't worry about that. If I have my choice, I'd rather start out too wet than too dry because it's very hard to make a pile wet, but it's pretty easy to make a pile dry. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So some of the mixing options, we have a front end loader. Every facility has one, so that tends to be the standard. But we also have these commercial mixer units like batch mixers and continuous feed. The batch mixers are like you see the two on the side. That you either have what's called a horizontal mixer, where you have a big wheel that fluffs it, and then two augers that move things back and forth, and then it deposits out the side. Or as in the bottom photo, you have a vertical mixer where you have two props and they basically mix the material. Either one does a really good job. They tend to be very expensive, but if you find a lot of farm sites will have three or four of these out in the field, because as they start to get older, they're not as efficient in creating the perfect mix for the animal's feed. So they'll buy a new one and stick that one out in the back 40. But for a compost process, they're perfectly fine. So you can usually get one pretty cheap. We picked up one that was an 8 yard system for our compost school for 6,500, and we've spent a bit of money keeping it up to snuff, but a lot less than it would be for a brand new unit. So definitely talk to farmers and look and see what you have for used equipment. A continuous feed is exactly what it says. It's a stationary mixer with two ports. One port is for putting in carbon, and one port is for putting in nitrogen, and it just feeds into a mixer that constantly moves and then pushes it out. So they're constantly filling both of the hoppers, and it's for a larger facility that needs a really strong throughput. Batch mixers are more for smaller communities and smaller operations. Another way is with a windrow turner. I'll show you one of those on the next slide, and then some of the farm-based equipment. So here we go. So here is a vertical mixer on the top left. It's doing the mix right now with the two props, and you let it sit for as long as you want, and then when it's done, it just discharges out the side. This is what's called a compost applicator. It's also a modified manure spreader. And once again, this does the same thing. These beater paddles at the end are what kick the manure way out if you want it to. If you're going to mix with it, you just turn your PTO speed down and it'll mix and then drop it out the back. And then you use your tractor bucket to reform it into a windrow. Over here is this is the actual facility that we have in Maine. It's an 8 cubic yard mixer. We use a regular tractor to fill it, and that one does a really great job. And then over here is a compost windrow turner. And what happens is that when that device goes through, there's a bar that as it spins, it kicks material into the air and off to the sides, and it creates a blend and a parabolic shape that is going to allow airflow into the pile, but it's going to have a profile that sheds excess precipitation. And then this is a fairly fancy newer version, but this is just another manure spreader. And you can see that the way a manure spreader works is the floor walks towards the back and moves the material, and then these blades spin and do the mixing. And if you slow them down enough, they're going to mix and then drop directly off the back. And it's just a good way to go. If you're in a situation where you're making your pile and you're worried about moisture, always start out a little wet. However, if you are trying to do it correctly and you don't want to have any potential leachate, you can start out dry, but it's just a little bit harder to get it to that right moisture. So given that, I start my compost blend and it's too wet. I got a couple options. I can spread it out and let it dry. I can turn it more often and let it dry, or I can mix in drier material. The latter option is my least preferred because whenever you add fresh carbon to an existing recipe, it upsets the balance. And now you have to figure out how to get back to that original recipe. If you mix in a finished compost, which has a seed and ratio of about 19:1, then that's okay. It's not going to really greatly alter the recipe. But as I said, it's better to start out a little wetter and then just dry it using turning as your tool. Now, on the flip side, let's say you start out with a really, really uh, great pile, but it dries out in the summer. Then you want to look at irrigation. And there's a couple of ways to do it. You can put a soaker hose on top, and that's preferred over taking a straight hose and spraying it because the piles tend to be hydrophobic. They don't want water. They will develop like almost like a natural crust that they want to shed excess precipitation. But if you put a soaker hose on top, there'll be a point at which it overwhelms that and will actually allow it to drain into the pile. It takes a lot of work to do it that way. A more simple method is to go ahead and take your front end loader and flatten the top of your windrow if you know it's going to rain. And that flat surface area will catch the water and allow it to seep down inside. So usually a better option. So when you do adjust for moisture, you want it optimal between 50 and 60%. We have 45 in previous slides. You want roughly more than 45, less than 65. 55 is kind of the sweet spot. It is the moisture where the microbes live. So without the moisture, the microbial activity will drop right down. So super important. If you do have a really wet situation and you notice that things are starting to produce anaerobic odors, volatile organic acids, things like that, all you got to do is just either fluff the pile, give it a chance to dry, and that's going to create that airspace and get those pores that are clogged with water flowing again. So, building your compost pile. The standard pile should be 6 to 8 feet high by 14 to 16 feet wide. That should actually say 12 because if it's 6 foot tall, you want a 2-to-1 slope. So the taller piles produce too much weight and may collapse inner core structure, which can be a problem. And as I said previously, leaf piles are the ones that can be 18, 20 feet tall and still not upset airflow because they're so fluffy. Couple other things to remember. This case right here, this windrow was only about 5.5 feet tall. However, we did a lot of trials with an artificial rain simulator, and we gave this specific windrow several 100-year storm events, 24-hour storm events. And as a result, it got pretty saturated. And what we noticed was that the water seeped down through to the bottom and created a very wet, compact zone that became anaerobic immediately and kind of stayed that way until the pile was turned. So that's super important to remember because piles breathe from their sides. And so if they're saturated, it's going to decrease that activity. And that's something that we don't want to see. The other thing is shape. If you notice right here, you see these really dark areas in this pile. They are located wherever there was a dent in the surface of the pile on the top. And that's where rainwater pooled and seeped in. So the way to fix that is to take a rake or other device, if you notice these depressions, and rake them smooth so that the top has that parabolic shape and it is not going to have this drainage getting in. This is the other thing. Whenever I work with communities, they want to show me they're doing a great job. So they'll build these piles and they'll drive right up on top of them, and it just gets crazy. It just, when you put the weight on the sides of the pile like that, you actually cause it to compress and air can't get into the center. So we never ever drive on the sides of our pile. So aeration provides oxygen to keep it aerobic, which helps prevent odors and keeps the microbes happy, essential for the optimal operation of a compost pile. And it is the basis for overall management. Now you ask, well, how do we know if there's enough oxygen in the pile if we don't have a special device like an oxygen measuring tool? And the answer is quite simple. We're going to talk about thermometers and taking temperatures. When I stick a thermometer into a compost pile and I get temperatures of 140 degrees, that tells me two important things. Number one, oxygen's getting to my microbes. Number two, I've got a bunch of microbes and they're very happy. So if I have a pile that's getting those temperatures, I don't worry about oxygen. If I have a pile that's not getting good temperatures, then absolutely I'm going to dig deeper into the pile and figure out what's going on. It's either going to be too dry or too wet. And we'll talk about troubleshooting a little bit later on. And you can be either actively aerating, where you use a blower or something like that, or you can passively aerate. And both systems work pretty well. So, as far as the compost pile activities, in order to get aeration in there, you could do two things. You can turn it, or you can use forced aeration, or passive aeration. The turning, basically the pile is turned either on a time or a temperature schedule. And either one of those can be your basis for operation. I like to take temperatures daily, and I take the temperatures at the 1 foot and the 3 foot level. And when those differ greatly, that tells me the pile needs to be turned. But during the turning process, oxygen is naturally introduced at 21%, but very quickly it bleeds out of the pile and only about 5% remains for the microbial activity. With the forced aeration, the pile is formed over some perforated pipes and a plenum, which I'll talk about in a second, and then it's attached to a blower system forcing air into the compost mixture. So let's start with a turn windrow. Using a front end loader, you layer the ingredients. Always start with lighter on the bottom, and that's normally your carbon source, aka your amendment, also known as your bulking agent. And then the heavier, wetter material go on top of that, and then a final layer of lighter materials. Then you turn with the loader and mix it until you get it to where you're ready to put it into a pile. Or you can turn it with a mechanical turner. So here is a farmer using his tractor to build a windrow. He's mixing all the ingredients together with the front end loader. This is the same farmer who built a pile that started with sawdust shavings on the bottom, bedded cow manure, horse manure on top of that, and then more shavings on top. And he's going to go through that with his windrow turner, and that's going to thoroughly mix the material and set it up for the compost process. So just another way of getting a good mix. Some of the things to remember if you're using a front end loader over a windrow turner, because it's cheaper and you got one already, if you mix and you mix in such a way that you're constantly dropping it, stuff that falls down the side will roll like a snowball, and it'll form these things called coconuts where they look fine on the outside, but when you bust in the center, they're rotten, decomposing material. So that's one of the problems with using a front end loader is you get a lot of these coconuts that can be odorous and not fully compost. The piles also take a great long time. If you have 500 feet of windrow and it's 8 feet tall by 16 feet wide, you're going to spend the greater part of a morning turning that. And that can be really bothersome to people that don't have a lot of time to waste on things. The other thing is that the front end loader tends to be the most valuable piece of equipment on site. And if you're using it to turn half the morning, that means nobody else has access to it. So those are things that need to be in consideration if you're a very busy complex. On the other hand, you have the windrow turner. And the windrow turner does an incredibly great job, but it is a one-trick pony. It is very expensive. Even the ones that haul behind tractors can be $20,000 for a small one. And normally the mid-range ones that most farms use are around $44,000, $45,000. It does create an incredibly better blend than the front end loader does. There's none of the coconuts. The recipe can be adjusted on the fly. If you're getting ready to turn a pile and you notice that one spot's kind of dead, you can bust it open and put more stuff in that you want. And then as you blast through it, it just blends it into everything else. So that's a really good thing. And then the best part of all is that what may take you half the morning to turn a windrow, with a windrow turn it may take you 15 minutes because they travel very quickly. The other nice thing is the one on the top, you can put more windrows on the pad because it straddles the whole pile. The one on the bottom, though, now you've got to have a lane for the tractor and a lane for your windrows. So that can definitely lead to some problems. And that's where we are now. Talking about the different problems that are available. That's one, it's space limited. Some of the advantages of turning does not require a thorough mixing at the outset, whereas an aerated static pile does. Pile problems can be corrected on the fly, we talked about. Doesn't require purchasing special equipment if you have a loader already. And it's ideally suited in rural settings, which is also very good. Disadvantages. As I said before, a larger footprint to accommodate equipment maneuvering. Frequent turning can cause pile structure to collapse, so you can overturn if you have a windrow turning device. As you scale up, turning becomes time consuming unless you buy a turner. and mechanized turners speed things up, but they are expensive. Now, other side of the coin is building an aerated static pile. In this case, you lay out sections of perforated PVC piping, whether it's going to be forced air or passive. You place a layer of coarse bulking agent over the piping to act as your plenum. You deposit premixed compost mixture on top, and you cover the entire mixture with 6 to 10 inches of some sort of finished compost or peat to act as an odor control biofilter, but does not upset the recipe that you have put together. And then you either attach the blowers or you leave the pipes open for passive. Some of the advantages of forced air, you do have better odor control during the potentially odorous first couple of weeks by constantly giving it a little bit of oxygen to keep it in the aerobic zone instead of letting it go anaerobic. As the moisture is assimilated, you don't have any periods where you get too much moisture in one area because the forced air also distributes moisture better in the pile too. It's a smaller footprint, so therefore you can put piles right next to each other, so more space for compost piles. You have much better process control if you have a great mix at the beginning. And it is suited for use at a covered compost facility, so you don't have to worry about precipitation effects. Some of the disadvantages, if you have excessive aeration, air will find channels that it likes throughout the pile, and those will be the only places to get air. Other areas will stay wet and moist. You'll have dead spots, you'll have stinky spots. So you constantly have to strive to have the best mix possible before you attach the air. Air will often, as I said, seek a path of least resistance. Pile must often be broken down and reformed, especially if you're trying to meet some standard. If you're doing the organic standard and they say that you have to have 3 consecutive days, 131 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're not able to achieve it, you are required to break that down and reform it and start over. So definitely that if you don't have a great mix, that can be something that can catch you up. And then blowers, monitoring systems, and piping can be expensive unless you really get the good stuff, and that will last for a long time, but it's a pretty big upfront expense. So this is the static pile construction. You start out with your piping on the bottom of some sort. You add wood chips to create your plenum. You put your compost mixture on top of that, and then you put your cover biofilter on top of that. And that process works pretty darn good. This is actually a past compost school student from Lisbon Falls. His name's Mark Goddard. As you can see on the top left, he uses leachate landfill drainage pipe. It's called HDPE. It is really excellent piping that does not bend, it doesn't break, but it's very expensive. So he has a significant investment right here. But all these pipes have holes pre-drilled, and he just puts a PVC adapter on the front with a little collar and a special metal plate on the bottom that acts as a slide so he can pull it in and out when he needs to break the piles down. And then this fitting attaches to these blower units, which are set on timers, and they come on for 10 to 15 minutes every hour to 2 hours. And that's his aeration. And these bays are about 40 feet deep and about 12 to 14 feet wide. And he gets a height of about 8 feet on top. What he uses for material, he uses straight sawdust shavings that he keeps in a building to prevent moisture from affecting him. He mixes that with lobster bodies from lobster fishermen. And then he mixes in a massive storage of horse manure, cow manure, alpaca manure, bedded pack, which is a type of sawdust shavings that are put under cows, but instead of being taken out each day, they're rototilled and allowed to fluff up and start to pre-compost. So it's a really aggressive material. He puts that mixture in this real Augie mix wagon right here, which has been modified to be stationary. And then that compost mix goes into his final piles, which look like this. And you can see that he gets a great pile height, a great distance, and he has one pipe, but the blower system is strong enough to keep that aerobic throughout the whole process. So as we said in the biology class, we want around 55% moisture in our pile. That provides the home for the microbes. If it gets greater than that, you have anaerobic conditions that can occur. And if it gets less than that, you have no place for the microbes to live. So activity will cease. And very much you either add water to it, which is very hard to do, or you turn it more frequently, which is the preferred method to manage moisture. We talked a little bit about this earlier. You can flatten the pile to collect water. Depressions can be formed in the pile that will capture water as well. You don't have to flatten it. You can just make some areas. If you have one spot that needs a little more moisture, you can just put a divot there. And if you want to prevent moisture penetration, just make the pile slope steep, and that will shed water. Another thing that we see used in Maine a lot are these compost pile covers. They shed precipitation, reduce the drying of the wind, which is great, especially in the summertime when we're facing drought. And they also, in the winter, will help insulate the piles and allow them to maintain their warmth. And these pile covers are available commercially. There's a couple of companies. There's one called Compost X. It's COMPOSTEX. They're, I believe, located somewhere down on the eastern seaboard, but they make the covers that you see here, and they're great for their intended purpose. But if you're a one-man band, they actually can be very hard to manipulate. They will freeze to a pile in the winter, so it requires a lot of work to get them off and put them back on again, but they will do a great job. I prefer in the wintertime, if I want to get the mass, I'll just combine two windrows and make them bigger, and that allows them to cook all winter. But these are a tool that can be used. So now, pile monitoring. The most important thing that you can do to manage your pile is to take temperatures on a daily basis. Temperatures tell us about everything we want to know from our compost pile. You want to take them at two depths. You want to take them at the 1 foot depth, which is the hottest level because it's the level that always faces the outside air. So that 1 foot is the one that gets the most air diffusion. So that's where you tend to see the most hottest aerobic activity. And then you take it in a 3 foot core to let us know how the core is doing as far as air penetrating. Is it starting to grow? Is it starting to develop? After the first week, if you take those temperatures on a daily basis, whatever the difference between the 1 foot and the 3 foot exceeds 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the pile is telling you it wants to turn. Whenever the 3 foot temperature is hotter than the 1 foot temperature, and we do this consistently across the windrow 5 or 6 places, if it averages that way hotter in the core than it is in the outside, that's the pile telling you it wants to be turned again. So, as I said, we'll take those 2 places and 5 locations across the windrow every single day, average the 1 foots together, the 3 foots together, and then we plot it on a graph. And what the graph tells us is exactly how the pile's doing over time. And every time you turn the pile, there's a dip, but then it recovers. So it tells you how well the pile's recovering from it. And it's just a great way to track the progress of your pile. So you want to take them 5 locations, same location every time. You want to record weather data. You want to chart the temperatures to check trends, and you want to record at least once a week, as far as keeping a graph together to see what's happening. One of the general rules of thumb is that if you have a sudden temperature drop for no external cause, there was no rain, there was no major wind, there was no real concern, you should turn the pile because that's an atypical type behavior. But if you turn the pile and the temperatures don't come back right away, if they're not back within 48 hours, then there's something wrong and you need to investigate further. So here's thermometer placement. Assuming that this is the ground level and you're standing next to the pile, you insert them waist high at a 45-degree angle. I put them together, and usually the 1 foot is on the left, and then right next to it is the 3 foot. And I use those together like that, and that helps me to figure out my pile temperatures on a daily basis. So what happens? You've done everything you can, but things still go wrong. So what can we do? First thing that you do is you use your senses to figure out what's happening. You look for colors, you look for texture, you dig into the pile, you look for steam, you look for litter, you look to see if there's any anomalies in the pile. When you dig into a fresh compost pile, you should start to see layering. There should be a lighter color on the outside and a darker color on the inside where the moisture is forming. And then between is going to be that fine layer of actinomycetes that we talked about in biology, that little white layer, that's the differentiation between the really hot aerobic zone and the not so hot aerobic zone in the bottom. So once we do that, then we smell. We smell for general odors. If you smell ammonia the first week, it's okay. There's a ton of nitrogen being assimilated. Not all of it's going to stay in the pile. If you smell volatile organic acids, really stinky, nasty smells, now you got some issues. And that's the pile going to need to be turned. If you smell the original feedstock ingredients, you did not mix it well enough. That by the end of week one, there should be no smells of it. It should be pretty much smelling like a composting material. And then touch. Check with the moisture with the squeeze test. Feel for pile warmth and density. When you stick your hand in that pile, if it's really hard to get it through, that pile is too dense, too wet, and probably is not getting good airflow. So all these tools you were born with, you don't need to buy them, and they all help you figure it out. That plus your thermometer, you've got all the tools you need to compost. So some of the troublemakers, nitrogen compounds. Ammonia is a leachable form of N, and it's usually in solution, which is fine until it gets turned into, so it goes from ammonia to ammonium, and that's through the compost process. In between, it can become nitrate, it can become nitrite, and it can also become more ammonia. It wants to go back and forth. It's a stability thing, depending upon the pH. If you're in a pile and the pH exceeds 8.5, it's going to cause all of your ammonia or your ammonium to lose a hydrogen through a chemical formula. And when it loses a hydrogen, it becomes ammonia. And that's going to cause ammonia to be lost from the pile. If the pile becomes too dry, then the ammonia that's held in solution becomes liberated, and that can also be lost from the pile. Ammonia is not it's an on-site issue, not an off-site issue, because it rapidly dissipates the second that it gets into the ambient air. So it's more of an issue of losing nutrients and making a weaker compost, really honestly. The organic acids, they're produced during periods of low pH or anaerobic conditions. They are prevalent the first week. But what happens is that as that compost starts chugging along, the microbes love these guys because they're full of energy and they're good for them. So they'll start eating these acids. So usually after the first week, those odors tend to go away. It's just the pile starts to catch up with it and they digest them all. But oftentimes the pile also needs to be turned. You give it a little turn and that will take care of it. Sulfur. Sulfur is a digester specific problem in most cases. Too much of it can lead to decreased efficiency in odorous releases. In our compost situation, we don't get a lot of methane, a lot of sulfur, things like that, because we convert things too quickly into aerobic conditions. And so it doesn't have a chance to really linger. But if a pile goes anaerobic and is allowed to stay that way, then methane can definitely be one of the byproducts that it creates. So we're going to talk a little bit about all these problems here. These are the common problems that occur, and we'll talk about how to solve them as we go through. So the first thing, I have a pile and it's not heating. There is usually a whole slew of potential causes, and you got to be a detective and figure it out. First thing is it too wet or dry? And if you do your squeeze test and generally look, there's not a lot of leachate around the bottom, then that's probably not an issue. So you don't have to worry about dealing with the moisture. The pH is too low or too high. I don't really worry about this one, to be honest, because as I said in previous talks, the pile buffers itself. But if I start out with a really low pH, let's say I'm using something like food that's been held in a pile for a long time and the pH is like 4.5, I might start out with some adjustment. I might add some lime to it to try and increase the pH a little bit, just to make sure it starts out with not a lot of problems. But in most cases, pH is not a real concern. If the mix is not uniform, and you can see that by there's just a whole bunch of extra manure and things there, that's something that you can't just let that ride. You got to go back and remix as best you can. That's super important. If you have like the particle sizes are too large or they're too small, then you're going to have to add in some finer textured material to deal with the too large because it means you're not incorporating a lot of the liquid. Or if it's really, really fine, you'll add some chips or something to try and get some more airflow in the pile. And then the seed end ratio is too low, too high. We want the recipe to be adjusted to 20 to 30 to 1, like we said in biology. If the seed end ratio is really high, it's just going to compost slower. But if the seed end ratio is really low, that's going to produce odors. It's going to be a potential for leachate. So in most cases, if you start out with the seed end ratio a little high, you're going to be able to kind of work the process fairly easily. And then the pile mass is too small. All you do there is just combine two piles together, and that increases the mass. But those are all easy fixes. Sometimes you'll get uneven compost temperatures. That's where you have the dead spots. And that's a hint that things aren't mixed well. And so we also tend to look at the bulk density. We want between 800 and 1,000 pounds per cubic yard. But if you mix, we used to do this in the state. It's not done that much anymore. But we used to have biosolids being mixed with sawdust shavings. That was a really hard blend because the biosolids had a really high bulk density and the shavings had a very low bulk density. If the materials aren't between 800 and 1,000 pounds per cubic yard each, mixture is going to be more difficult. So the end result is they tended to be over amended, and that just made the compost period take longer than it should. And then finally, just remixing the pile will often take care of this uneven compost temperature problem. Odors. This is a study we did in 2004. This is just a massive pile of wood chips with one dead cow inside. And I'll tell you that cows have a four-chambered stomach, and each one has different microbial populations. When they break down anaerobically in a really stinky way, and have a lot of moisture in that. And what it did is it rose to the top of the pile, and it started to attract flies. And the flies laid eggs on top, and the maggots were everywhere. And that pile got so full of maggots that it would quiver and shake as you walked by it. And so we had to do a lot of work. We had to turn it, and then we had to mix in some hot material to try and kill the maggots. So, but odors are produced, as I said, whenever we have natural issues. As I said, ammonia is only a local problem, and it's if you have a pH that's too high, above 8.5, if you have a pile that's too dry, or you have seed end ratio is less than 20 to 1, and there's excess amounts of nitrogen that's not being consumed by the microbes, it's going to come off as ammonia. That's how it all wants to go, is it wants to rapidly turn into ammonia, and then it gets dissipated. Rotting smell is if the pH is too low, so it's super acidic, the pile is too wet, or it has poor porosity due to compaction. And that's where driving on the side of the pile can lead to this problem. Some of the influences that odor has, meteorology, topography. At the end of the day, air cools and condenses, and that's your biggest nightmare. During the day, you have an asphalt pad, you're composting on it. Anything that's odorous shoots up into the atmosphere. You never realize it's there. You never think there's a problem. Then all of a sudden, about 9, 10 o'clock at night, the air cools and condenses. Maybe there's a little fog, and people can't stand the smell. And you're like, it didn't smell today, but now it smells. So that's due to that atmospheric instability. It's called a thermal inversion. The other thing that odors like to do is they like to follow natural channels, streams or power lines, things like that. And they like to follow topography and go downhill. So if you have on a mountainside, you have a power line channel that goes down into the valley to all these houses and you're composting, those odors will travel right downhill and through the valley and to your neighbors. They also like to follow prevailing winds. So if prevailing winds point to a nursing home, probably not a great place to site your facility. So just things to think about. So how do we correct for odors? Once again, it's figure the probable cause and then come up with a cure. Most time, odors are due to something in the pile being out of whack. And the quick solution, if it's a weekend and you don't want to deal with it till Monday, is you cover it with 8 inches of finished compost or peat, something that's not going to upset the recipe. And then Monday, you start doing the sleuthing work. But as I said, if the pH is too low or too high and you started out that way, then you might want to add something to buffer it. but in most cases, that's the least important one. If the pile is too dry or too wet, then you're going to have to adjust it. And so, as I said, if you start with a pile that's too wet, it's easier to fix than a pile that's too dry. C&N ratio is too low. That means that you've got to put some more carbon in there. And the earlier, the better, so it doesn't upset the rest of the process. And then if the pile's too dense, limiting oxygen, you can do a couple things. You can remix it and fluff it and hope it dries it and decreases the density. Or you can add some bulking agents like some wood chips, something to give some more structural porosity to it. Leachate. When I first started doing regulatory work for the DEP, I used to go to sites, compost sites, and I would see things like this and say, geez, you got to fix this right away because this stuff's going offside. It can pollute people's wells. We can't have that. And most of the time, I didn't get a lot of cooperation. Then one day I mentioned to someone that all the nutrients and the value in their compost was washing away. And that got their attention. And that's when I realized, you can be a regulator, but you can also be a reducator. And I found that that was what led the rest of my career was being able to provide this education to help others understand instead of trying to, say, here's the rules, follow them. Here's why you should follow the rules because you want a good product to sell. But it is basically the liquid loss of nutrients from the pile. Some of the things you want to be aware of, if it comes if you're at the base of a slope and there's a lot of water that rushes down, you want to divert that away because when it runs through your site, it becomes dirty water or leachate. So if you divert it away and it never touches your piles, then it stays as clean water. If you have a lot of precipitation and your piles are small, you can consider using those compost covers. Uh, when you make your recipe, you want to get 55% moisture. So getting a good recipe will help you hit that sweet spot. If you're worried about groundwater discharges, wherever you're going to compost, bring in fill and raise it up so that you have separation to groundwater. And then ultimately, especially during the growing season, at the downslope of your pad, which should have about a 2 to 4% slope, at the downslope end, you can put out a filter area that basically comes at a 0%. So as the material leaves the pad, it spreads out in a sheet flow and goes over this grassy area, which can absorb nutrients. Then they call it a level spreader. Or you can pump it, put a sump pump down in the lower corner and then pump it back onto the pile. That's a preferred method for me. Or you can have a bunch of amendment down there, catch the leachate, and then throw that back in the pile. Or you can pump it and dispose of it, but that is really the last resort, super expensive option. So we talked about it already being a liquid loss of nutrients to the pile. It's either a poor mixture or you have a lot of precipitation that leads to it. And once again, it's just remixing it and getting it to that 55% moisture. All right. Now, the bane of my existence are flies and rats. Those are the two things that bother people like crazy. Both are attracted to the smells and nutrients released from a compost pile, either due to poor mixing, not enough cover, or just straight leachate from precipitation events, things like that. We fix it initially by covering with an 8-inch thick layer of hot active compost because you want to kill the flies and the maggots on the surface of the pile. And in doing so, it wipes out the reproductive cycle. And as a matter of fact, you can see the whole cycle right here. It takes about 12 to 24 days. You start out with two adult flies. They lay the eggs. It goes from the larval instar to the prepupa to the pupa to the adult. And stable flies can be 12 days and other flies may take 24. But if any time during that cycle you hit it with good hot active compost, that will take care of the problem. This is an example of what happens. Turkeys are the number one problem we have in Maine for outside compost piles, and they will find maggots and they will dig your pile like crazy. And I've seen piles completely destroyed by turkeys. And the end result is you just cover it with as much material as you can to kill the maggots and to keep the pile going aerobically. Dust is a big problem. Dust is can also be an issue for your neighbors. Remember, I when I talked about siting and designing a facility, I talked about the fact that always have trees between you and your neighbors because people smell with their eyeballs. Well, on a site with lots of dust, they think it's fire, they think it's smoke. And if you're by a place where there's people watching you all day long, they might call the fire department. So having a good kind of visual buffer is a good thing. But generally, dust is created by screening, storage, and mixing. And it's when you have really, really low moisture. And so the way that you fix that is making sure that the piles you have that are getting dry, you keep them moist. Your mixture, you always favor 55% moisture, and then re-wet the piles as necessary. Now, if it gets really, really dry, we don't really have this problem in Maine with compost. I've seen it occur in a couple of our mulch operations that have piles that are 20, 25 feet tall, but we don't really see it in composting. But it's a big deal out in the arid Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, places like that. These large piles, they make them too big, over 8 feet. They rapidly exhaust the moisture and they become super dry. Now, in the summertime, when we get really hot, we perspire. When that perspiration evaporates, it cools us down. A compost pile does the same thing until it has no moisture. Then what happens is it just continues to stay hot and hot and hot, and it can result in problems that can be leading to spontaneous combustion and things like that. But the biggest key to remember with a pile fire is you don't spray it with water because that drives oxygen into the pile and it keeps the process going because it's basically moisture starved. And it is a huge mass of material and it just keeps the process going and going and going. Instead, you take an excavator, bust into the pile, spread it out, decrease the volume, and then you can soak down the pile that way. It's going to be more responsive to moisture and not apt to keep kicking forward into high gear. It does the basically the things that we do in our state is you have a fire prevention plan. We have you create adequate travel ways between your piles so that fire apparatuses can get in and do what they need to do. And smaller piles don't exceed 8 feet. If you don't exceed 8 feet, you're not going to have these issues with the spontaneous combustion. And that's really kind of the key thing. And in the end, honestly, if you follow all these processes that we talked about today, you're going to have a great compost operation with very few problems. And I think I'll end with some places you can get some good information. We have the composting handbook, which was produced. It's by Robert Rink, and it's available on Amazon and other places. It's the Bible. It's really, really good. You're welcome to reach out to me anytime with any questions you have. If you want to look at our Compost School webpage, composting.org, a lot of cool stuff there. And then I would encourage you, if you're not a member already, to subscribe to BioCycle Connect. It is the solid waste journal that used to be published and now it's completely online. And it is an incredibly excellent resource for helping you with information about composting and composting challenges. And finally, just reach out to your state agencies. If you're not in Maine, you can reach out your Department of Agriculture, USDA, your NRCS, your extension offices. All these folks are getting training or are ready to help you in any way possible. And Victor, I think that's it. I will stop sharing.
Well, thanks, Mark. We had a few questions for you.
Okay, go ahead.
So the first one, I think you kind of talked about it a little bit, but what if we have a fly problem? Why can't we put lime on our pile, like cover it?
Okay, that's a great question. So remember I told you that I didn't think pH was a big deal. Where pH is a big deal is the over application of a pH adjuster. When you add lime to your pile, you got to be very careful because if you add too much, it'll actually suppress microbial activity and it can really kill the pile. So if you have a situation with flies, I'd rather see you add a more aggressive composting material because that's going to kill them and it's not going to upset the balance of the pile. Good question.
Okay, so you could take finished compost that you have stored over there and maybe mix a little bit in, or you want something that's really hot and active.
I'd like it hot and active if I have a big fly problem, but if I have just a little odor, I'd cover it with some finished compost. That's fine.
Okay. I think I'll take this next question, and that was, when will the next segment be available? So the answer, simply enough, is we're going to be going out on May 12th to look at a few sites and shoot some video. And then we'll shortly after have that up on the mra.net website under the FRC logo. And the test you'll take 50 questions, still free of charge. And that'll just help you it's more of a self-evaluation than to punish you.
Yep.
Okay, we have another question. Is it in person, this test? Can you tell us a little bit about that, Mark?
Sure. So we're working with a pretty savvy college intern named Ash, and she's going to put together a test that you'll be able to take online, and it is a self-evaluation. I believe that we will have your results sent to us, final results. And that way, when you've reached did we say 70 or 75%, Vic? I don't remember.
70%.
70%. So as long as you get a 70% or better, and you can take it multiple times, and you can view the videos multiple times. So once you get a 70% or better, you then could reach out to Vic for certification. So it's a good thing.
Good. And I think somebody maybe didn't hear quite when we said where are the videos located. So I've shared my screen. You just go to mra.net and you scroll down. You see a Food Recovery Council logo here. Click on that. Then that'll take you to our little brochure about the council. You have the food loss and waste generation study here you could take a look at. And then down near the bottom, we have them listed out 1, 2, 3, and then you'll see 4 show up here, and then eventually there'll be 5, and we'll send an email to remind you, like, hey, go take a look.
Absolutely.
Okay,
And I would
and
throw in
one
there
more
too,
question.
Vic, that they should consider joining the Food Recovery Council because the more voices and opinions we have, the better we'll understand the direction we want to take this thing in the future.
Right, exactly. So I had one other question, and it was, Mark, are you familiar with the Johnson Sioux bioreactor?
Yes, I am. It's very similar to the lobster trap bin that I showed you at the very beginning, the backyard system. It's a little taller. I think they go sometimes 6 to 8 feet tall, but it's a huge cylinder and it tends to be covered with a tarp all around. But in the top, they insert PVC pipes that have holes drilled in them. And the idea is that you create the perfect compost blend. You insert these pipes all the way from the top to the bottom, add your tarp around the sides, and then you let this thing sit for 9 to 12 months. And the idea is that it aerobically composts, but also fungi and other microorganisms get to proliferate, worms get in there, and it's supposed to create a more holistic soil amendment. And the fact that it goes aerobic and it encourages fungi and it encourages worms to come up inside, all are really good things. So I think it's a really great process.
Thanks, Mark. So
Yes,
with
sir.
that, we'll end today's session, and we will see you next time.
Sounds great. All right.
Okay, I think